You have no idea how exciting it is to be back here. We haven't been to the mission in a number of years, and we were remembering when Bob and I taught a class of translation of historical documents, and we brought 3 students to give a talk here. It was for the Gran Kivira. I don't think that exists anymore. And Charlie and Lee Heisman opened their home to our students, and we had a lovely dinner there with you. We still remember that. And ironically, this morning, I got a message from Esmeralda, who was one of the students at the house. And I thought, whoa, this is really amazing, this synchronicity of this. And I told her we were going to be here, and we didn't know if we'd see you or not. And she did say, well, if you remember the nice people who made us that great dinner, could you please tell them I said hello? So hello from Esmeralda, for sure. And one thing I want to say before we start speaking is how much we value all of you who work here at the mission as docents. You are the people who are on the front lines when these students and their teachers come. You're the ones who give them the correct information, and we just appreciate you so much, and we really, well, see, even they appreciate you. We really love being able to share our information with you, knowing that you appreciate what we're doing and that you will impart that knowledge to the students and to the teachers. So thank you. We really, really appreciate all your hard work.
So we're going to talk tonight about Saint Junípero, Father Serra. And basically, as you know, he's, over the last couple of years especially, has become a very focused kind of person for many people dealing with early California. This picture here was taken in Rome in the spring of 2015 at the North American College, where Pope Francis was celebrating a Mass after a seminar on Serra at the North American College. And what's happening here is that Archbishop Gomez, the Archbishop of Los Angeles, is presenting the Pope with a relic of Father Serra, which the Pope is venerating. This happened in the spring, and then in the fall, in September, as you know, Pope Francis came to the U.S. and in D.C. at Catholic University. He performed the canonization ceremony for Father Serra. This, of course, was very controversial. Michelle mentioned Facebook, and there was a Facebook group called Say No to Sainthood for Serra. And this kind of focus on Serra, this kind of binary focus, totally for and totally against, is something that goes way back in California history. And it largely stems from the work of this woman. This woman, a 19th century woman, was Helen Hunt Jackson. She had written a book in the early 1880s about the oppression of Indians in North America. A Century of Dishonor, it was called. And she wanted, through this book, to publicize the way in which the United States had mistreated Native Americans. The book did not have any effect whatsoever. It did not have the effect that she wanted. And so she figured that what she would do is she tried to write a novel making the same point, the way that Native peoples had been mistreated. And of course, the novel turns out to be Ramona, which is published in 1884, shortly before her death. And she meant this novel, she hoped that Ramona would do for Native Americans what she thought Uncle Tom's Cabin had done for African Americans a couple of decades earlier. But Ramona had exactly the opposite kind of effect, because her portrayal of life in California before the gold rush was a very romantic portrayal, and that's what really the public glommed onto. And Ramona turned out to be a book which was a crucial book in formulating a view of pre-US California, which was a very romanticized view, which was a view that was very much articulated by a movement called the Spanish Revival Movement. And in that Spanish Revival Movement, which started in Southern California, the latter part of the 19th century, the missions are presented as civilizing agents to uncivilized Native Americans. And Junípero Serra becomes kind of the symbol of the mission era. And in the more extreme versions of the Spanish Revival movement, Serra becomes kind of the symbol of everything that happens in California before the gold rush. And Serra becomes, in the latter part of the 19th century, the preeminent figure in dealing with pre-US California. Jane Stanford, founder of Stanford University, was the one that really financed the statue of Serra. This is a statue of Serra in Monterey, the Monterey Bay. James Duval Phelan, the mayor of San Francisco, was instrumental in putting a statue of Junípero Serra in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. This was the time in which the El Camino Real becomes kind of the physical symbol, along with the missions themselves, of Spanish and Mexican California. The myth grows up that the missions were placed a day's journey apart from each other. And the Automobile Club of Southern California was really the one that was behind this myth, because they wanted people to visit the missions and drive these newfangled things called cars. And so the bell, which is still there on Highway 101, and the El Camino Real become kind of symbolic in this whole thing. Of course, one of the major manifestations of this is the Mission Inn in Riverside, done by Frank Miller. And I'm sure a number of you have been there. You know. And then right outside of Riverside, there is there's the statue of Serra outside on top of one of the mountains, Mount Rubidoux. And this is taken on Easter morning. A huge sunrise service takes place right underneath Father Serra's statue. And the myths of Serra, through the Spanish revival, the myths proliferate. One of the great myths, which Father Maynard Geiger, the great Franciscan historian and biographer of Father Serra, Geiger calls it the seemingly unconquerable legend that from the time that Serra landed in the New World, he never rode a mule again. He walked all the time. And so, Stanford University Press in the 1950s publishes a book, Fray Junípero Serra, the Great Walker, and in all of the statues of Serra outside the missions, he's got a staff, you know, and that staff comes from the notion that he constantly walked and never rose. Well, of course, as you can think, you know, from those of you who know history, when there's an interpretation, there's going to be a reinterpretation, a negative. If it's very positive, it's going to end up being negative. It's very negative, it's going to end up being positive. And during the 1940s, it first starts with Carrie McWilliams, who was actually a journalist who wrote a book called Southern California, Country and Island in the Land. And in one of the pages of this book, McWilliams, World War II has just ended. 1946, this book comes out. The Franciscan Padres eliminated Indians with the effectiveness of Nazis operating concentration camps. Right? And so, you know, from being very positive, it's very, very negative. Excuse me. And the more scholarly reinterpretation was led by Jack Forbes, a native Coahuila person, who published a very, very important article in the Americas, which is the Journal of the Academy of American Franciscan History. They published this, The Historian and the Indian, Racial Bias in American History. On the popular level, the occupation of Alcatraz in 1969 to 1971 gives a kind of a publicity to the Indian rights movement, which along with the women's movement and the Chicano movement and the African American movement was a feature of American life in the late 60s and early 70s. And this gets, you know, the kind of the culmination of this is in this book published in the mid-1980s, The Missions of California, A Legacy of Genocide. And that word genocide, of course, becomes a word that has a long life in the kind of the negative view. So in many ways, you know, in the canonization of Serra, you get, you know, the devil, Junípero Serra, and of course Archbishop Gomez, whom we saw at the beginning, becomes the devil's advocate. And so you get a tremendous kind of polarization of Junípero Serra, and the polarization starts, almost a century, more than a century ago with the Spanish Revival movement, and the polarization continues. Well, when Rosemary and I started working on Father Serra, a book on him, which was in the, 10 years or so ago, more than that, canonization was not even in the cards. We wanted to try to get beyond this polarization. That was one of the things that we really wanted to do. And we picked an event that happened, to begin the book, we picked an event that happened in 1776, which to us seemed to encapsulate what Junípero Serra wanted to do as a missionary in the Americas. And the event actually takes place in December of 1776 during a tremendous rainstorm. And in October of 1776, Serra leaves San Diego, where he had been down there trying to start the rebuilding of the missions after the missions were destroyed. The mission was destroyed by the Kumeyaay Rebellion. As you know, in November 1st, on his way up, what does he do? He refounds Capistrano on November 1st, 1776, and then he keeps going farther up back to Carmel. When he gets outside the Santa Barbara Channel, there's a tremendous rainstorm, and you all know, being in Southern California, what this can look like. This past winter with the great mudslides, what happened. So it's very difficult for Serra because they're in the middle of Chumash territory. And after they leave San Gabriel, there is no Spanish institution until they get to San Luis Obispo. The Chumash are completely untouched by Spanish presence. And in fact, it had been very difficult to try to establish any kind of mission or presence there. And so in this driving rainstorm, they're going along the beach, past Ventura, past Carpinteria, up towards Santa Barbara. What happens is, because of these tremendous rainstorms and floods, they have to go up to the hillside, and they go up to the foothills. And when they're up at the foothills, they're all very conscious. There's 2 priests and about 3 or 4 soldiers. They're very conscious that they're in hostile territory and an ambush can happen. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a group of Chumash Indians appears. And this is how Serra described what happens.
Okay. I want you to take a really close look at this picture, because what I'm going to read to you, what Serra said, is depicted in this watercolor. Since I could not travel on foot or on horseback, with one person on each side, the Indians took hold of my arms and carried me over the muddy hills. I was not able to repay them for their efforts and their act of compassion, nor do I think I will ever be able to repay them as I would hope to do. So as you see here, this happened in South America, but this is what Serra was talking about. So he was really, really grateful for the treatment, the kind treatment they gave him. Now, as Bob mentioned, we worked on the Serra book for over 10 years. Actually, we started it before 2004 when he had his first hip surgery, Charlie. And working and reading Serra's writings for so long, you really get into the man's head. And any of you who have found diaries or letters of your parents in the attic or in a suitcase, and you open them and you read them and you think, wow, the emotions that come out in these letters, the personality that comes out, I didn't realize my mom was like this or my granddad or whoever. And that's kind of what I felt when I was translating Serra's material. I really felt the presence of a human being, not a myth. A human being, warts and all. And he was somebody who displayed a tremendous range of emotions. His intellect would come out from the page, and sometimes I thought, yeah, okay, you're lecturing me. He was a Scotistic scholar that would come out at different times. And I just was always amazed at how Serra, the conflicted soul, was in those writings. There's one incident where he's writing about how he just didn't know how to comfort a friend. And then there are other letters in which Junípero Serra, the son, is saying, I don't know how to handle leaving my homeland and leaving my aged parents. I don't know, I may never see my aging parents again. And we all can identify with that kind of thing. Now, before setting sail from Cadiz to cross the Atlantic, Serra wrote a very touching letter to a priest in Majorca expressing how he felt being faced with this possibility of never seeing his aging parents again. The language of this letter is a mixture of joy and sadness, anticipation, regret, enthusiasm, melancholy, and this is just a little trocito, a little fragment of what he said on August 20th, 1749. My beloved friend, I am at a loss for words, yet overwhelmed by emotion as I depart. I beg you once again to comfort my parents. I know they will be greatly affected by my leaving. I wish I could instill in them the great joy that I am experiencing, because I believe they would urge me to go forth and never turn back. And he never did see them again. Now, Serra kept an extensive diary of his journey from Baja California to San Diego, and some of you may have read this diary. This document is the longest text composed by Serra that has survived, and in many ways, I think it is his most personal. In many of the diary entries, we can clearly see that Serra had a sense of humor. Now, some of you are going in your mind, oh, that statue of the man with the walking staff, sense of humor, funny, really? I mentioned that to students, and they go, I don't think so. Well, he had a very witty, dry, sarcastic, and sometimes a very childlike sense of humor. The guy was a blast. I mean, there were times when I was translating his stuff, and I'm going, that is so cool, that is so funny. In the following example, taken from the June 19th, 1769 entry in the diary, Serra describes what happened to a burro, and he does a play on words with the word homicide. Now keep that in mind, homicide. Okay. On today's journey, one of the Señor Gobernador's servants, a Genoese cook, showed the strength of his sword by thrusting it into the hindquarters of a she-ass, because that animal had the audacity of cutting in front of the cook when he was riding and thus slowing him down. The she-ass died at the cook's feet. The Señor Gobernador was convinced a crime had been committed based on the statements of eyewitnesses and the confession of the man who committed the burricide. Burricidio is the word in Spanish. No such word. You can check it in the Real Academia dictionary. So he's being kind of cute on that one. So he does have a sense of humor.
In our work on Serra and in this presentation, the main focus is on his missionary life, and that means his relationship between himself and the native peoples of California that he had come over to try to evangelize. Serra himself was born in the Mediterranean island of Majorca. He was born in the small village of Petra, which is on the western side there. Small agricultural village. He worked the fields as he was growing up. He worked the field with his father. Petra, like many Spanish villages, if you've ever been to Spain, you know this. You know, if one church is good, two churches are better. So it had two churches. The church on the right, San Pedro, is the church in which he was baptized. And the church on the left, San Bernardino, is where he went to grammar school. And he went to a grammar school that was run by the Franciscans. And Serra remembered that experience in that grammar school. And decades later, when he gets to California, and the first child that he baptizes in the church of San Carlos in Monterey, this is how he puts it down in the baptismal register.
On December 26, 1770, in the church of this mission, San Carlos in Monterrey, I solemnly baptized a boy, about 5 years old, the son of Gentile parents who willingly presented him to the Catholic Church, and I named him Bernardino de Jesus.
So he names the first baby that he baptizes, the first boy that he baptizes, he names him in honor of the church in Majorca where he had gone to grammar school. That experience of Majorca never left him. Indeed, one of the great devotions in the village of Petra was a devotion to the Virgin Mary under the name of Our Lady of Bon Any. Bon Any is the Catalan or Mallorquin way of saying buen año, good year. And the story was that in 1609, there was a drought in Majorca, in Petra especially. And the villagers built a shrine to Mary on top of the highest hill in the region. And they prayed to the Virgin to send the rains. And sure enough, the rains came. And 1609 was from that time forward commemorated in Majorca as the Buen Año, or the good year. We'll flash forward decades. In 1782, there's a drought in Carmel. The rains are not coming. And this is how Serra described the baptism that he did during that year.
On September 3rd, 1782, in the church of this mission, San Carlos de Monterrey, I solemnly baptized a girl, about 13 years old, the daughter of Gentile parents from Sargenta Ruc. I gave her the name Maria de Buen Año, in honor of Most Holy Mary of my beloved homeland.
So what he's doing is he's obviously praying to Mary to do the same thing in Carmel that he and Majorcans believed she had done in Majorca in 1609. So the memories of growing up in this agricultural community never really left him. Serra spent the first 15 years of his life in Petra. When he was 16, he moved to Palma, the capital of Majorca, which is right there. There he, after some back and forth, he entered the Franciscans. He spent a year as a Franciscan novice, learning Franciscan spirituality. At the end of that year, he took his vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience as a Franciscan. And when he took his vows, he did something very, very unusual. In fact, he seems to be the only Majorcan Franciscan that we know of who did this. He actually changed his name. His baptismal name was Miguel, but he changed his name to Junípero in honor of Brother Junípero, who was one of the original companions of St. Francis of Assisi. And in the Franciscan tradition, which Serra had been studying during that year of novitiate, Brother Junípero was known for his simplicity and his humility. And anybody who knows anything about Junípero Serra knows that simplicity and humility are not words that come to mind when you talk about Serra. So probably at 16 years old, he knew himself well enough to know that he's going to need some help being humble and being simple. And changing his name is a way of appealing to the Franciscan tradition and to Brother Junípero to help him do that. So from a very early period, he has a good sense of self-knowledge. After he finishes his novitiate, he moves into Palma and spends the next 20 years of his life. This church and this Franciscan residence associated with this church is where Serra spent more years of his life than any other place. Church of San Francisco in Palma. And that's a statue, that's a contemporary picture, that's a statue of Serra outside that church. There he studied philosophy, he studied theology, and in 1737 he was ordained a priest. He continued living there. He went to kind of graduate school, and he ends up being a professor of theology at the Franciscan University in Palma, which was one of the major institutions of higher learning in Palma. In Palma, in the Franciscan tradition, one of the major figures was a 13th century Franciscan named Ramon Llull, who was buried in San Francisco. So, for 20 years, Serra walked by Llull's grave every day. Llull was a Majorcan missionary. He had gone to North Africa to preach the gospel to the Muslims. And he was celebrated as a missionary in Majorca. And in doing so, he's basically following the example of St. Francis himself, who during one of the Crusades went to Egypt and got an audience with the Sultan of Egypt. And they had kind of a theological discussion back and forth as Francis preached to the Sultan. So missionary activity was a very, very important part of Franciscan spirituality, but an especially important part of Majorcan spirituality as well. We don't have a lot of writings from Serra during this time. Majorca is a small island. You don't have to write to people. You see them all the time. But what we do have is we have 4 sermons that he gave in 1744 in this convent, the convent of Santa Clara. It's a convent of Poor Clares, of sisters. And in 1744, he gave a series of Lenten sermons to the sisters. And we have those, or we have 3 complete ones and most of the 4th one. And Serra, for the theme of these sermons, takes a verse from one of the Psalms, Psalm 33. Taste and see that the Lord is good. And this is how he developed in these sermons that theme.
Anyone who has tasted the sweetness of the Lord just once regards as empty all of this life's pleasures and delights, if they even deserve to be called these. Those who do not know anything about this sweetness and do not taste it do not have any appetite for it. But someone who has tried it just once discovers that he has an increasing appetite for it, for he finds it very soothing. As the Lord himself says, those who eat of me will hunger for more, and those who drink of me will thirst for more.
So God, in the way that Serra is preaching, God is kind of like a sweet, a piece of candy, a sweetness. And if you never tasted it, you don't know what you're missing. But once you do taste it, once you find that you have an increasing appetite for it. And this is kind of, Rosemary and I think that this is the way that he's going to want to do his missionary activity, gradually introduce people to this sweetness. But there's another part of God as well. God can punish us. And God is like a father, and fathers love, and fathers sometimes have to punish. And this is the way he describes that to the sisters.
But you will say, how can the tender love of a father for his child be reconciled with punishing and afflicting him? Actually, a harmony between love and strictness is what characterizes a true father. It is precisely because the father loves him that he teaches him to obey. When he misbehaves, the father scolds and punishes him so that the son can correct his mistakes. In this way, even though it might seem at first glance that the son is his father's slave, it becomes clear that he is his father's deeply beloved son. The divine Father behaves in a similar way with men, who are his own sons.
And Serra used another analogy, the analogy between a doctor and a patient, to drive home that same point.
And in this one, we have audience participation. You will have to answer the question that Serra is asking you. So tell me, which doctor loves his patients? The one who treats them with bitter liquids and bleeding, or the one who indulges his patient's whims and does not forbid anything that the patient's corrupted taste might long for? Certainly you will answer, which one? First one or second one? Ooh, it's divided here. It's the first one. Maybe some of you have a better experience at Kaiser than I do, but it's the first one.
So Serra is a very, very well-known, respected academic in Palma. He is one of the best-known Franciscans in the entire town. We don't know why, but at some point in the late 1740s, he begins to have kind of a crisis. I think, as a priest, he's asking himself, is this what I was ordained for? Is this, I need to do something sort of pastoral. I need to do something different. Well, for Serra, as a Majorcan Franciscan, doing something different means one thing. It means following St. Francis and following Ramon Llull. And so what he does is he volunteers to go to the missions. The missions means America. And in 1749, along with 2 of his former students, Francisco Palou and Juan Crespi, he leaves Palma and goes to first Malaga, then Cadiz, and sails across the Atlantic. In December of 1749, he lands at Veracruz, and he does actually walk from Veracruz to Mexico City. And on January 1st, 1750, he arrives here at the Colegio de San Fernando, a Franciscan missionary headquarters in Mexico City. He and Palou spend basically 6 months there. And they're much older than most of the other people there. And at the end of that 6 months, in June of 1750, he and Palou are sent out to missionary activity in an area about 200 miles north of Mexico City, outside the town of Querétaro, in a rugged area called the Sierra Gorda. The Franciscans had had missions there in the Sierra Gorda for a few years, and in the Sierra Gorda, they are ministering to a group of people. The Sierra Gorda is kind of a transition zone between the more sedentary group of people in the Valley of Mexico, the Aztecs and people like that, and the more nomadic people in the northern part of the Comanches and the Apaches and the Seris and people, the more nomadic groups in the north. So the group is called the Chichimecas that live in the Sierra Gorda. Chichimeca is an Aztec term meaning sons of dogs. It's an insult because these people are not regarded by the more civilized, quote unquote, native peoples in the Valley of Mexico as kind of having it all together. So it's a tough area. It's a very, very difficult area. Mission San Jose Visaron, the first Franciscan mission, was founded in 1740, 10 years before Serra gets there. And Serra himself becomes, at least he spends 8 years there. And for at least 3 of those years, he's the head missionary, the president of the missions in the Sierra Gorda. And these missions are beautiful. A number of these stone facades. This is on Landa. Above is Conca. To the left is the mission at Jalpan, which is where Serra lived for 8 years. They're beautiful stone facades. This is Tancoyal. In 2003, UNESCO named these 5 missions a World Culture Heritage Site because the stone facades are so spectacular. And some of these stone facades were at least begun during the time that Serra was himself in the Sierra Gorda. But in the Sierra Gorda, he runs into some kind of problems because the leading military figure in the area is José de Escandón, who is a Spanish military figure who basically doesn't like missions. And he really thinks that the missionaries are kind of monopolizing all of the good land, and Escandón wants to bring in settlers and start ranches in this area. And Escandón, in fact, was the one who, after he leaves the Sierra Gorda, he goes up and starts the colonization of an area called Nuevo Santander, which is, you can see on the top right there, it says Texas. It's right below the Rio Grande River. And in this colonization of Nuevo Santander, Escandón doesn't want any missions at all. He wants basically the mission, priests should do what priests do, say mass, and that's it. And so there's a big controversy there. And for Serra and the missionaries, this brings back very, very personally a big fight which missionaries had with Spanish colonists going all the way back to the 1500s. In Santo Domingo, in 1509, a Dominican priest, Antonio de Montesinos, had got up in the cathedral the first Sunday of Advent and denounced the treatment of the Indians by the conquistadores. Of course, the greatest person who did that was Bartolome de las Casas, who becomes the bishop of Chiapas, and then goes back to Spain and writes a tremendous denunciation. And so in the religious tradition, missionaries have a job of protecting the Indians from exploitation by settlers. And in fact, New Spain, in Mexico, Indians were routinely conscripted to work in the silver mines. They were uprooted from the native villages and made to work as virtual slaves in the silver mines. So the missionary ideology was really a protective ideology. What do settlers do? Settlers do the same thing that the conquistadores had done in 1500. They oppress Indians. And we've got to protect native peoples from that. So Serra learns that in the Sierra Gorda. In 1758, he is suddenly recalled to Mexico City. There he is told that the Comanche Indians have destroyed a mission in Texas called San Saba, about 200 miles north of San Antonio, that he and his friend Palou are going to go to San Saba and take over that mission. So Serra gets ready to go to Texas. He's told, you're going to go as soon as the Spanish army gets out there and pacifies the Comanches. Spanish army gets out there and is soundly defeated by the Comanches. And so Serra doesn't go to Texas. So he basically spends the next 8 years stationed in Mexico City, going around to various locations and giving a series of domestic missions. And these are some of the places we know he preached in during those 8 years. He was with a group of priests who would be invited into a diocese by a bishop and invited to give missions, to kind of spark a renewal of faith among congregations where the bishop or the clergy thought that that fervor was waning. And so they'd have benedictions, they'd have processions, they'd have confessions, the whole thing. While he was there in one of those, he gets involved in an Inquisition case in an area called the Huasteca, where in a particular village, one woman accuses another woman of being a witch. And Serra basically takes down the testimony of both of the women. The interesting thing is that both of these women were of mixed race. One was a mulata, which was the Spanish term for somebody who has both Spanish and indigenous blood, and the other one was a loba, which is the Spanish term for somebody who has Spanish and African blood. So they're mixed race. And Serra, as he's taking down the testimony, and we have the whole transcript in our book, really gets a first-hand view of the way in which, in the countryside, native religious beliefs mix up with Christian belief. And you get a kind of a syncretism. And this is really, really something that's very prevalent in peasant communities in central Mexico. This is a good example of this. This is a mural on a church, a Catholic church in Hidalgo. And you can see that what you've got there is a jaguar warrior, an Aztec figure, decorating the walls of a Catholic church. And it's a great symbol of the kind of syncretism or the mix between traditional indigenous beliefs and imported Spanish Catholic beliefs, and the way in which these two systems kind of, in a way, combine with each other. So it's neither totally indigenous nor is it totally Spanish. Well, Serra's out giving one of these missions, and in 1767, once again, he is suddenly recalled to Mexico City, and there he's told that the King of Spain, Carlos III, has expelled the Jesuits from Spain and from the entire Spanish Empire, and that the Franciscans had been assigned to take over the former Jesuit missions in Baja California. And there were about 15 of them, from San Jose del Cabo in the south all the way up to Santa Maria in the north. Serra jumps at, and Serra said, you're going to be in charge of that. He jumps at that chance. Why does he do that? Because, I said a few minutes ago, he leaves Majorca to become a missionary, to preach the gospel to people who've never heard it. Well, he spent now 16 years in America not having had a chance to do that. The Pame Indians with whom he worked in the Sierra Gorda had already been evangelized before he got there. And when he was giving these domestic missions, he's talking to people who are already baptized or members of congregations, of churches, So he's never really had the chance to be a missionary in the way that he wanted to do that. And so he jumped because he knows that the Jesuits have been expanding their mission frontier farther and farther north, and they figure, I go to Baja California, I'm going to be a part of that. I'm going to be able to preach the gospel to unbaptized people. But it gets even better for Serra than that. Because a couple of months after he arrives in Baja California, this gentleman arrives, Jose de Galvez. He had been sent over by the king to New Spain to do a whole bunch of things. He had an odd title. The title was called Visitor General, but it basically was spelled B-O-S-S. He outranked the viceroy. He comes to Baja California and says to Serra, you know, the Spanish ambassador in Moscow has been picking up rumors that the Russians are moving pretty quickly across Siberia. Once they get to Alaska, they're going to be able to come down very fast. We need to establish a presence farther north. Would you be interested? He jumps at the chance. And so what he does is he leaves Loreto, which had been the former Jesuit headquarters and where he had been living. He leaves it, goes up and visits the various missions, this great stone church about 25 miles outside of Loreto where Palou, his friend, had been stationed, San Francisco Javier. Goes to there, passes Mission Guadalupe, former Jesuit mission. You can see the ruins there. Mission Santa Gertrudis. The Jesuits had a whole bunch of missions. Goes past La Purísima Concepción. This is how it looked at the beginning of the 20th century. Goes to the farthest north Jesuit mission, Santa Maria de los Angeles, and then finally arrives at San Fernando de Velicata, which is where the governor, Gaspar de Portola, had said that that would be the staging ground for the expedition. And they're getting ready to leave. And on May 15th, 1769, Serra has what is clearly one of the most emotional days of his entire life. And this is how he describes it in his diary.
For me, it was a day of great consolation. Soon after the masses were said, while I was quiet with my thoughts in the small hut that was my dwelling place, they alerted me that the Gentiles were approaching and that they were close. I praised God, kissed the ground, and gave thanks to our Lord for granting me this opportunity to be among the Gentiles in their land, after longing for this for so many years. I saw what I could hardly believe when I would read about it or when I would be told about it, which was that the Gentiles were totally naked, like Adam in paradise before the fall. That is how they went about, and that is how they presented themselves to us. We interacted with them for quite some time, and not once did they show any sign of embarrassment, seeing that we were clothed and they were not. I placed my hands on the head of each Gentile, one at a time, as a sign of affection.
So you can see the emotion in that phrase. You know, he's finally seeing for the first time people who have not been preached to, people who have not been baptized, and he's overcome. I kissed the ground, I cried, you know, and I placed my hand on him. He's just enormously excited because now he believes that he is finally finding the purpose for which he came to the New World. And so he goes up from San Fernando de Velicata to San Diego. And in his diary, you can see his excitement. You can sense it as he's getting closer and closer, and he's finding himself surrounded by people he calls Gentiles, non-baptized people.
Yeah, and the next thing I'm going to read to you, it happened near Ensenada, present-day Ensenada. It seems to me that even though we have seen many Indians, we have not seen so many gathered together in one place as we have here. And as to their friendly nature, I cannot find the appropriate words to describe it. In addition to the countless number of men, a large group of women and children sat around me in a circle. One of the women wanted me to hold the infant she was nursing. I held him in my arms for a while, so wishing that I could baptize him, but I then returned the child to his mother. I make the sign of the cross and bless each of them. I have them say Jesus and Mary. I give them what I am able to give and cherish them in the best way I can.
And a couple of days later, outside what is now the resort town of Rosarito Beach, this is how he describes another meeting.
When I give them something to eat, they usually tell me with very clear gestures that they don't want that. Instead, they want me to give them my holy habit, and they grab me by the sleeve. If I had given the habit to all who requested it, I already would have a large community of Gentile friars. I told you he was funny. Okay.
So on July 1st, 1769, Serra and Portola arrive in San Diego. And this is the page of Serra's diary in his own handwriting. Right? And you can see, Port of San Diego, thanks be to God. It's like writing an email all in capital letters. You know, he's just really, really excited about that. Portola's job, his job was to occupy the two ports that earlier explorers had discovered, San Diego and Monterey. And so they occupy San Diego in the first beginning of July, 1769. We'll talk more about the expedition tomorrow. They don't get to Monterey until basically the spring of 1770. And this is the port of Monterey as it was drawn by Miguel Costanzo, who was on the expedition. And there in San Diego, he had founded Mission San Diego. And in Monterey, he founds Mission San Carlos. We don't know exactly what the scene looked like, but we can be absolutely certain it did not look anything like this.
No, no.
This was done, in 1877 at the beginning of the Spanish Revival movement. If those of you who've been to Monterey know where the Presidio is, it's kind of where Church Street is, near the estuary. And Serra then founded the mission right there, right next to the Presidio. But he's not there for more than 2 weeks before we find him writing back to Spain that this is not a good site for a mission. And this is how he explains it.
There's no Indian village at all in the vicinity of this port. Because of this, if we see that the Indians are determined to accept our holy faith, we need to recognize the special difficulty they will have in taking up residence here. It might be necessary to leave the Presidio and with a few soldiers of the escort, move the mission close to the Carmel River, 2 short leagues to the south. It is a truly splendid location, capable of producing abundant crops because of the plentiful and excellent land and water.
The Presidio wasn't where the Indians were. And we know what Serra wanted the mission to be. It wanted to be a place where people could gradually come and taste and see what the gospel was about. So he needed to move the mission closer to where the people he wanted to evangelize actually were. Well, Serra spends, and he finally does move the mission in 1771. As you probably know, and we'll say a little bit more about it tomorrow, he has a whole series of fights with the military governor, Pedro Fages. Finally, at the end of 1772, he decides to go down to Mexico City. He gets a personal audience with the viceroy in Mexico City, gets the viceroy to fire Fages and replace him with somebody else as governor. Then he comes back to California, lands at San Diego, and then goes overland from San Diego back to Carmel. With him during this whole trip has been a young boy from the Monterey area whom he had baptized and to whom he had given the name Juan Evangelista, John the Evangelist. And Juan had been with him during the whole time. He had met the viceroy in Mexico City. He had been wined and dined by everybody in Mexico City. And on their way back from San Diego to Carmel, Serra has a series of conversations with Juan about what your people believe. And this is how he describes these conversations.
I asked Juan Evangelista if when he and his people saw us, that is, the padres, soldiers, and officers, if they had ever imagined such a land where everybody wore clothing. Juan said no. They believed all lands to be like theirs. And with respect to the soldiers and the padres, after they had taken a long, hard look at them, they believed them to be the sons of the mules that were carrying them. I replied that, according to that belief, he and his people probably imagined there were lands where mules give birth to men in clothing. Juan said no, but rather the elders said they had come out from under the ground and that they were the souls, in their way of thinking, of the old Gentiles from that area who had reappeared in that manner. However, he now recognized that none of that was true, and he would tell that to his people.
See, so what he's doing there is he's trying to find out from Juan, and then this probably summarizes a whole series of conversations that he had not only with Juan, but with a whole bunch of other native peoples. He's trying to find out what their belief systems is so that he can kind of try to figure out how most comfortably he can begin to introduce some notions of Christianity. And the notions of Christianity and its relationship to an indigenous spirituality is still something that's very, very interesting. About the year and a half between the time Serra returned from Mexico City about a year and a half after that, this was for him the high point of his missionary life in California. He really believed that on the banks of the Carmel River, he is creating a situation in which indigenous native spirituality and traditional Spanish Catholicism are beginning to come together. And he describes a couple of events that happened in the summer of 1775, which make this point for him.
The harvesting of the wheat began on July 18th. It had to be prolonged until August 11th, because as soon as the harvesting began, so many sardines appeared on the beach near the mission that we found it necessary to harvest wheat until noon and then gather sardines in the afternoon. This arrangement lasted for 20 consecutive days. After 2 weeks of meatless meals, the following Sunday, the Indians took a break from eating sardines and went out as a group to look for young birds that were the size of a large hen. They spent that Sunday camped out on the beach of Carmel, divided up into countless little groups, each with its own fire upon which they roasted the birds, and then they ate. I went with 2 other padres to see the gathering. It was a period of contentment, a beautiful setting.
So you see what's happening, what he's describing here is a situation at Carmel Mission where the days are equally divided between traditional occupations, harvesting sardines, and imported occupations, harvesting wheat. And you get this picture of the Rumsen Ohlone Indians and family groups along the beach, and the priests kind of very appreciatively going in and out of traditional family groups. So it's really a mix of indigenous and Spanish spiritualities that Serra believes are coming together. And this is the high point of his life. And that high point ends on a specific night, on the night of December 13th, 1775. On that night, Fernando de Rivera y Moncada, who was the military commander at the Presidio, at 8 o'clock at night, in total darkness, personally rode from the Presidio to Mission Carmel, a couple of miles. There he told Serra that he had just received word that Mission San Diego had been destroyed in an attack by Kumeyaay people, and that one of the missionaries, Father Luis Jaime, a friend of Serra's from Majorca, had been killed. And that news made Serra think about a number of things. But one of them was, what about if something should happen to me? And this is how he describes it in a letter to the Viceroy.
One of the most important things I requested of the Visitor General at the beginning of these conquests was that if the Indians were to kill me, whether they be Gentiles or Christians, they should be forgiven. It is only right that for as long as the missionary is alive, the soldiers should guard and watch over him as God would guard the apple of his eye. But if they have already killed the missionary, what are we going to gain with military campaigns? I am saying, so that others are not killed, guard the missionaries better than you guarded the deceased, and let the murderer live so he can be saved, which is the purpose of our coming here and the reason for forgiving him. Help him to understand, with some moderate punishment, that he is being pardoned in accordance with our law, which orders us to forgive offenses and to prepare him not for his death, but for eternal life.
So this notion of punishment, and when the military went out after the destruction of Mission San Diego to try to find out who was the leaders of this rebellion, the punishments that they gave were pretty harsh. And Serra himself believed in punishment. He interpreted this as being a good father, as we saw in those sermons that he gave to the sisters in Majorca. And punishment was something that was a part of the mission experience. Punishment and coercion were an integral and indisputable part of what happened at the missions. And I think anybody needs to understand that, one of the things the missionaries did not do especially well was they didn't say to the native peoples, they didn't explain to them very well, if at all, that from the point of view of Christian theology, Catholic theology, baptism was a lifetime commitment, and you couldn't unbaptize yourself. And that meant that if you decided to enter the mission and be baptized, you were going to stay there, right? And so if somebody gets baptized, the reasons why people get baptized are a variety of reasons, including being polite, hoping that the priest might be able to help or heal a sick relative, a variety of reasons, besides wanting to be a Christian. If people decided that's fine, thank you very much, now I'll go back to where I grew up and live there, that was not allowed. And when people were given the okay, and they were to go back to their villages for a couple of weeks, and didn't come back, soldiers would often be sent out to bring them back. And the punishment was flogging, which was the standard punishment in the Spanish army and in in areas of the Spanish Empire, which, like California, were controlled by the army. And this is how Serra described something in Carmel.
Last Friday, I sent 11 adults to the mountains in search of my lost sheep, the Indians. Last night, they brought back to me 9 neophytes from this mission. I am sending 4 of them to you for punishment, a period of time in exile and 2 or 3 rounds of whipping. This should be a good lesson for them as well as for the others, and it will be of spiritual benefit for everyone, which is the goal of our efforts. If you do not have shackles on hand, if you would let us know, they can be sent from here. I believe their punishment should last a month.
Now, this is not easy to listen to. Serra's saying to the commander, hey, if you guys don't have enough shackles at the Presidio, we've got plenty here at the mission, and we can lend you some. So that just underlines the fact that coercion and violence was an integral part of mission life. Now, Serra interpreted this, as I said, as being a good father. But there is enough evidence that not everybody, even at that time, interpreted it in the same way. And some people have tried, you'll hear this sometimes, some people have said, well, the missionaries did flog themselves too, which they did. Flagellation was, especially in times like the Black Death in Europe, you had these huge flagellation processions going around, and a number of missionaries privately flogged themselves as penance for their own sins. But, flagellation was meant to be private, and a good religious was supposed to flagellate himself and not tell anybody else that they were doing it and go about their life normally, right? Flogging, on the other hand, was meant to be painful, was meant to be public, and that was meant to be serious. And a number of missionaries kind of, they realized that this was not something that was widely accepted.
Well, Serra also justified flogging by appealing to some stories that were current in the religious narrative of the Americas. And he cited a tradition relating to Hernán Cortés that originated in Franciscan circles. According to this story, which you can find in popular writings in New Spain, in Texcoco, an Indian was flogged because he had missed Mass. And obviously, this caused tremendous anger in the local indigenous community. So Cortés came up with this plan. He arranged with the priests that he, Cortés, would be late for the next Mass himself, and he would allow himself to be publicly whipped for this offense. The story says that in this way, the Indians were taught that everybody has to obey religious edicts and that they were not being singled out for the punishment. And we believe that the existence of this story indicates that at least some missionaries realized that the widespread flogging of the native peoples was extremely controversial, and in their minds it required some kind of justification from sources.
And this particular story doesn't appear in anything other than religious literature. It doesn't appear in any of the secular literature. So it's probably something that was made up because the missionaries realized that by, maybe in 1600, everybody agreed that flogging was great. By 1780, with the Enlightenment and things like that, flogging was increasingly controversial. So Serra, after the destruction of San Diego, Serra spent the last half of his life in California was not as happy as the first half. There was a new governor replacing Rivera, Felipe de Neve. Neve's mandate was to start pueblos in California, civil towns outside the jurisdiction of the missions. Serra bitterly opposed them, but Neve nevertheless started two. The first one was San Jose, which was founded in 1777. And the second one was Los Angeles, which was founded in 1781. Serra basically was unsuccessful in stopping the founding of the pueblos. And so what he does during the last 5 years of his life is he basically contents himself with going around to the existing missions. And one thing that really upset him was that he couldn't have found very many more missions. After San Diego, 2 missions which had been already scheduled to be set up, San Francisco and Santa Clara, were founded in 1776 and January of 1777. But from then on, only one more mission, San Buenaventura, was founded, and that really irked Serra. So what he decides to do is he makes a series of journeys giving confirmation, giving the sacrament of confirmation to people at the particular missions. He comes here to Capistrano twice, as you know, in October of 1778, and then there's a fight with Neve about whether he has the power to do that, and he has to stop for a couple of years. And then again in October of 1783, he returns to Capistrano, and the first time he confirmed 147 people. And in the second time, he confirmed 221 people during the couple of days that he was here. He loved this because it gave him the opportunity to have face-to-face contact with virtually every baptized Indian in California. And by that time, there were almost 6,000 of them. And he really, really enjoyed that. But by this time, he's in his late 60s, and he's beginning to slow down. And in fact, in 1784, as he was returning to Carmel from a confirmation journey, he ends up at Mission Santa Clara, and Francisco Palou, who had founded Mission Dolores in San Francisco, happened to be at Santa Clara at the same time. And this is how Palou described their interaction.
Even though I was thinking about going back to my mission, he stopped me from leaving. He said he wanted to prepare for his death in case we would not see one another again, for he was already feeble and he probably did not have much time left to live. He spent several days in spiritual exercises and made a general confession, or repeated the one he had made at other times. He shed many tears, and I no fewer. I was upset that this might be the last time we would see one another.
And so Serra returned to Carmel, Palou returned to San Francisco. A couple of months later, the missionaries at Carmel sent Palou an urgent message saying that Serra was seriously declining. Palou hurried down back to Carmel, and he arrived there at the end of August in 1784. And this is how he describes what happened.
Capitan and Comandante Don José Cañizares, whom he knew very well ever since the first expedition in 1769, and the royal chaplain, Don Cristobal Diaz, whom he had also met in this port in 1779, arrived at the mission. He gave them an extraordinary welcome by ordering the solemn ringing of the bells in their honor. He stood up and warmly embraced them as if he were not ill, and engaged in the customary formalities of respect that a religious would afford such officers. After listening to their stories, he said, "Well, señores, after so much time that has passed since we last saw one another, and after all of your travels, I thank you for coming to this port from so far away to throw a bit of earth on top of me." When everyone who was present heard this, we were all surprised. There he was, seated on his small chair made of reeds, answering every question, his mind as sharp as ever. As soon as he was finished, I told him it was already past 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and I asked him if he would like to have a cup of broth. He said yes and took it. After giving thanks, he said, "Well, we must now rest." He walked on his own to the small room where he had his bed, which was more like a bench. After taking off only his mantle, he lay down on the boards that were covered with the blanket and his holy cross, so he could rest. We all thought he was going to sleep, since he had not slept at all during the entire night. The gentleman went out to eat. I was a bit worried, so a short time later I returned to his room and went over to his bed to see if he was sleeping. I found him exactly as we had left him just a short while before, but now he was asleep in the Lord. He showed no signs of having struggled. The only evidence of death was that his breathing had stopped. But it really did seem like he was sleeping. We piously believe that he went to sleep in the Lord a little before 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the feast day of San Agustin, August 28th, in the year 1784, and that he would be receiving his heavenly reward for his apostolic labors.
So Pelou stayed in Carmel for a week. He conducted Serra's funeral arrangements and services. He took some of Serra's papers with him from Carmel back to Mission Dolores, and he spent the next couple of months at Mission Dolores drafting up the first book that was ever written in Alta California, which was Pelou's biography of Junípero Serra, which was published in Mexico City a couple of years later in 1787. As you remember from the beginning of our presentation, Junípero Serra had a very, very long afterlife. His grave was periodically reopened. This was in 1882, at which time Carmel Mission was basically falling apart. It was reopened again in the 1930s. This particular picture has become the iconic picture of Serra. We don't know very much about it. It was actually discovered in the 1920s. It was painted by a Mexican priest, Jose Mosqueda, who said that he copied it from a Franciscan house in Querétaro, where Serra had visited, and that the original picture had been destroyed during the chaos of the Mexican Revolution of the 19-teens. Right? And it showed up it finally appeared in Santa Barbara. It's become kind of the iconic picture of Serra.
This photograph is of Carmel Mission. It was taken in 1949, and as the caption says, as seen through the eyes of Manuel Maya Fresunier, a Catalonian master stonemason, maestro de obras. This photograph was taken exactly 200 years after Junípero Serra left Majorca. This picture, this photograph, was taken by my grandfather. My grandfather was Manuel Maya Fresunier, and my dad was with him. My grandfather loved photographing the missions, and my dad was trying to impress his soon-to-be father-in-law. My parents got married in 1950, so he accompanied him there to take these pictures. And this photograph is really important to me, not just because my grandfather took it, but because when I was a child, he instilled in me the importance of the missions and the fact that it was the Indians who did the work. The Franciscans supervised, but the indigenous people were the ones who did the work. And as a child, he let me play hod carrier, and probably nobody knows what a hod carrier, you guys do, but a lot of people don't. I had a baby basket, and I would take bricks around for him and stuff. But it gave me a taste of what it was like. It was hard work hauling this material. So I think it's really important, those of you who are docents, when the school children ask you, oh, were the Franciscans out there making the bricks and making the mission? It's really important for them to know that it was the indigenous people who did this work. They were the ones who sweat and toiled doing this.
As far as indigenous people go, we believe that when we pass on to the next worlds, we become one with the soil. From there comes the trees, the mud, all that goes into the adobe bricks, the logs in there. So we are actually part of the missions as well. So as indigenous people, we believe that we are not just working in them, but we're actually inside the walls. We're actually there. So it's a living legacy for us.
It's really, really important to get that message across. And that's what my grandfather was trying to tell me, but Carla was much more articulate in explaining that. This is me with that's our new dog, Cody. And we were in there at the mission and talking to Father Serra, the two of us. But the reason I have this picture up here is that I'm hoping that when people gaze at the grave of San Junípero, that they will look at him with different eyes. We hope that our research and our presentations can help people see that Junípero Serra is a multi-dimensional individual, And he's not simply a cardboard figure, a statue in some garden, a faultless hero, or an unreconstructed villain.
People are going to continue to disagree about Serra's activities, about his influences, about his legacy, like all major historical figures, like Alexander Hamilton. Serra is going to be interpreted and reinterpreted and reinterpreted. We hope that our book and our presentation and your presentations to the fourth graders and to other people who visit the mission can contribute to that ongoing reassessment by providing a picture of Junípero Serra, an accurate rendering of a complex man in a very, very challenging environment and a challenging world.
This is a collaborative issue or a collaborative endeavor between all of you and us. We all need to get the truth out there to the visitors, to the people, and break down these myths. It doesn't do anybody any good to perpetuate those myths. I want to thank you for your kind presence and attention. It's always so lovely speaking to docents and to people who are really interested in the topic. And if you haven't seen our book, well, there's a big picture of it there. We are so proud that Michelle has the book here, and if you're interested in purchasing it, it's really not expensive. I've seen children's books more expensive than this. It's $35, and it has all kinds of color inserts. The University of Oklahoma Press was very generous with us, and this book is considered the definitive biography of Serra by the Vatican. And it's not pro-Serra, anti-Serra. It's Serra in his own words. It's objective. It's Serra, warts and all. So the Pope has a copy, and we're kind of happy about that. So thank you so much. If
Thank
you have any
all
questions,
very, very much.
Thank you.